Daf Lamed Aleph and Aleph will begin Daf Lamed Amud base 2 lines from the bottom. We learned previously that the tefillah that's required before entering the Azara, according to Ben Zoma, it's a tefillah d'oraisa. We learn out of Kal V'Chaimer, and that Ben Kodesh l'Kodesh, the tefillah is required, Kal V'Chaimer, Ben Chol l'Kodesh, from entering Chol into Kodesh. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's a takana d'Rabbanan. He says Srach Tefillah Hizu. He says that this is in order to remind him in case he was Tomei and he forgot to remind him before entering the Azor. So Rabbi Gemara Amrle by Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Tamar Srach Tefillah Hizu. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who says the requirement over here is only to remind himself for the tefillah, so meaning it's a takana d'Rabbanan. So the question is, do we say a chatzitza passes it or not? A chatzitza, if there's a separation between his body and the waters of the mikveh, does it disqualify the tefillah or not? So obviously a pashut, according to Ben Zoma, which is tefillah d'oraisa, it's his chaitzas, like every tefillah. But over here, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since it's only a takana d'Rabbanan, is it chaitzas or not? Rabbi Yosef says, called the Tikkun Rabbanan, Kain D'Oraisa Tikkun. Even though it says Rabbanan is second, that Takana is Kain D'Oraisa, similar to the D'Oraisa. So since it would be a D'Oraisa, it would passel. It passes over here, even though it's a Rabbanan. Amrlei by Rabbi Yosef, B'mixash may be a oiloi. Is a partial entry, is that considered an entry or not? So we're not talking over here in terms of bia b'mixas, a partial entering of his body into the Azor. There's a discussion throughout Shas about bia b'mixas, that a partial entry of the body into the Azor, is that considered like he entered into the Azor, he entered into Tumah. So Tesa explains that this is not our discussion over here. What our discussion over here is, we have a requirement for tefillah. We say before entering the Azor that the person has to be taival. What about if he only has a partial entry, only part of his body enters? Is there still a requirement for tefillah? So Amar Lei, Rav Yosef said to Abaye, behind us yechichu, we'll bring a raya, we can bring a raya from the thumbs of the Messiah. They'll prove it. Shein be b'mixas, because the Messiah only puts his thumbs into it. He stands outside the Azara, and he stands only in the entry to the Azara, but he extends his thumbs into it. And nevertheless, since it's only his thumb, even though it's only his thumbs, it's not his whole body, Vatanya, but nevertheless, we learned the Brisa, Mitzayra, by Mitzayra, Taivel, V'em V'shan the corner. He stands in the shiny corner, he's Taivel, he stands in the shiny corner, he extends his thumbs and his feet inside. So even though he's only extending part of his body, nevertheless, he still requires a tefillah. So you see that a tefillah is required, even though it's only for a bia b'mixas. Tosfos asks the question, then how can we prove from here, how can we resolve here according to the shlit of Rabbi Yehuda? Now, Rashi, the way Rashi learned the sugya, this shaila over here, the shaila that we had previously by chatzitza, this shaila over here by bia mixes is a shaila according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that the requirement is a takana d'Rabbanan. The requirement of tefillah is a takana d'Rabbanan. Tosfos himself learns the sugya differently, but he asks, according to Rashi, that learns that it's only the requirement is for it's a takana to remind himself of Tumah. Now, how are we resolving from this brisa? How are we resolving, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that tefillah is required for a bia b'mixas? This requirement of tefillah for the Mitzayir is only according to the Rabbanan Oregon Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda himself says there's no requirement for tefillah by the Mitzayir because he was taival on the previous evening. So how are we resolving this according to Rabbi Yehuda? Tosfos answers that yes, this is true. It's true that this is the Rabbanan who require it, but the reason Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require the tefillah is because the Mitzayir was taival from beforehand. But if he would require a tefillah, if the Mitzayir was not taival from beforehand, the tefillah would be required. And the geder of the tefillah is the same according to the Rabbanan and according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbanan require the tefillah. They say the tefillah that was done yesterday is not sufficient. And you see that bia b'mixas, that even though it's only a bia b'mixas, it's still the tefillah is required. Now Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require the tefillah, he says because it was done beforehand. But if he would require the tefillah, and for other people where a tefillah is required, then the getter is the same, and therefore, even though it would be b'mixas, you would need a tefillah. In Boilahu, we have the following Shaila Mashi Asasakin Arucha V'Yishk. Can a person make a long knife, stand outside the Azora and shech? Now, as Rashi explains over here, the question isn't can he do the shlit in that manner. We know from the Gemara and Zvachim that he certainly can. The issue is related to our discussion. Is a tvila required? If a person is not coming into the Azora, and it's not even part of his limb that's in the Azora, it's not even a biba mixus, he's just extending the knife into the Azora, is similarly a tvila required. Tiboila ben Zayma, Tiboila Rabbanan, the Plegala, the Rav Yehuda. And you can ask the Kash according to Ben Zayma, who says that it's a tefillah is a deraisa, and you can ask according to Rabbanan that argue on Rav Yehuda. Tiboila ben Zayma, you can ask a question according to Ben Zayma, Ad kan Aloy Mechayim ben Zayma, Elal Gavoy. That even though Ben Zayma says that tefillah is a deraisa, but that's only for the person who's standing inside. But if he's going to be remaining outside, you don't have to have a tefillah, even though the knife is extended inside. Or perhaps we say no, maybe he would require it, maybe he would be machmer, because we're afraid that if the knife is inside, he himself might come inside, and he can't come in without a tefillah, so therefore we would require a tefillah. And Tiboila Rabbana the Pligala Rav Yehuda, and you can ask the question according to the Rabbana that argue on Rav Yehuda, because Adkan Laikom Rabbanan Hasam Dulukay Avid Avoid. Where do they say that the person who's not a Mitzayra does not require a tefillah because he's undoing an avodah? Now the Rabbanan that we're talking about here, the Rabbanan that argue on Rabbi Yehuda, it's the Rabbanan of the third Brisa. The Rabbanan of the third Brisa that we mentioned previously, that they hold, and they argue on the Tan of our Mishnah, that they hold that a tefillah is not required before entering the Azor. But perhaps they say that a tefillah is not required before entering the Azora, that's only if a person is not going to do the avodah. Aval hacha the koavet avodah, but over here, where an avodah is being done, these extending the knife and doing the shchita, then perhaps these Rabbanan would say that a tefillah is required. They only say it's not required by entering without an avodah, but entering with an avodah, even if he's not personally entering, then it would be required a demolition, or perhaps there's no difference. Teku. So we say it's a teku. Now, according to Rizvah, he says it's clear from this Gemara and the Dirshu that we have over here. The question is according to Ben Zayma and the Rabbanan that argue on Rav Yehuda. It's not a question according to Rav Yehuda, because the purpose of the tefillah according to Rav Yehuda is to remind the person of any old tuma, to jog his memory. So we would not inquire according to Rav Yehuda himself. Now, this is the way the sugya is according to the Girsa of that we have. The Taisei Yeshanim learns that the inquiry is on Rav Yehuda, not on the Rabbanan that argue on Rav Yehuda. The Mishnah continues and it says, Chamesh tefillas v'asar kiddushin tayvel. The Kohen Gadol does 5 tefillas and 10 times where he's mekadesh from yadayim raglayim. Ton Rabbanan Chamesh tefillas v'asar kiddushin tayvel Kohen Gadol mekadesh b'miyay. The Kohen Gadol does 5 tefillas and 10 kiddushin. The kulam b'kodesh b'beis parva, and all of these tefillas are done b'kodesh and the kodesh and the mikveh that was in the Beis Parva, in the Parva chamber, and that was B'Kaidish. That was in the area that had the Kedusha of the Azor. Chutz Mirishayna, except for the very first tefillah that he does before entering the Azora, Shaisa B'Chol, that was in an area that was not Niskadish, was not sanctified by Kedusha Azora, and that was Al Gabi Sharamayim. That was on the roof of the Sharamayim, the water gate. It was Sad Lishkos HaIsa, and that was on the side of his Lishka, the Lishka's base of Tinais. That was on the side of that Lishka, it was on the south side of the Azora. So that one was Bechol. Omer Abaye, Abaye says, Shemami no, you can learn out from here that Ein Itam Gavoya Mikarka Azora Esrim Mishol Shamas. That Ein Itam. The Ein Itam, so that was the spring, the Mayan that fed the water to the mikveh. So that water from that Mayan, they had a canal that the water flowed into the mikveh. That was called Ein Itam, and perhaps it's the Mei Naftayach that's mentioned in Tanakh. That was the Ein Itam, who had to be 23 amas higher than the floor of the Azor. Now the water doesn't flow up, water flows down. So that Ein Itam was in the highest part of Yerushalayim. And it had to be 23 amas higher than the floor of the Azar. Why is that? It's not. All of the gates that were in the base of Migdash, Gevaya, Gaivan, Esrim Amma, they were 20 amas high. Verachman, Esrim Amas, and 10 amas wide. Chutz Mishal Ulam, except the entranceway, the gateway to the Ulam. So the Ulam was the antechamber, the Ulam that was before the Heichal, except for that gateway, that entranceway over there, that was 40 amas high. So, therefore, where the mikvah stood, the mikvah was here by the Shar HaMayim, was on the gate there was 20 amas high, and the mikvah was on top of it. So the mikvah was higher than the gate, which was already 20 amas high. The Tanya, we learn, the pasuk says V'rochas b'sarai b'mayim. So it says V'rochas b'sarai b'mayim. The Rashash is Magia that the pasuk says V'rochas b'mayim es kol b'sarai. It says V'rochas b'mayim es kol b'sarai. You have to be toivel in a mikvah. It says b'mayim. It doesn't say b'mayim. It says b'mayim. That means in a specific water. So it says b'mayim b'mei mikvah. In a specific water, not any water. It's a specific water. That means that is mei mikvah. It can't be maim she'uvim. It can't be water that's drawn, that you, let's say, draw in a bucket and pick up and pour into the mikvah. It has to be naturally flowing water that is into the mikvah, not maim she'uvim, not drawn water. It's specific water, b'mayim. It says, and he rachatz b'mayim es kol b'sara. So it says kol b'sara, its entire body's entire flesh. It has to be enough water that he can immerse his whole body in it at one time. It has to have that volume of water. So what is that volume of water? It has to have the dimensions of 1 amma by 1 amma with 3 ammas high. So it is 1 by 1 by 3 high, which is a total of Shiru Chachamim me mikvah arboim saw. And they estimated that the total volume of water is 40 saw, that a mikveh is only kosher with 40 saw. So therefore we see that the mikveh had to have a height of 3 amas. So therefore you have the height of the shar, and then you also have the height of the mikveh, so therefore the water can't flow up, so therefore the Ein Itam had to be 23 amas higher than the floor of the Zohar. Practically Gemara, it would have to be even higher, because Vayika Amma Tikra Amma Maziva, you need an extra 2 amas. You need 1 amma, that you need an amma to have the floor of the mikveh. It had to have, to support the mikveh, you needed the floor of the mikveh. It had to be an amma. And you also had to have an amma to support the mikveh on top of the gate. You needed an amma for the floor of the mikveh to avoid it from leaking, and you had another amma to support the mikveh that was on top of the gate, so it had to be even higher. The more answers no. Sharm, the base of mikdash, the gates of the mikdash, like base of mikdash, cave the shishan, since they were made out of marble, they were strong and it was smooth. You didn't need an amma for a tikra and amma ma'asiva. But mashu avdilay, you only needed a mashu. You needed a mashu for a tikra, a mashu for ma'asiva. Mashu, but sof kol sof, you have that mashu, that little bit, even if you say it's a minimal amount for the ceiling and the floor, but the still, nevertheless, you still have that mashu. The more answers came in yes, it's true, and it was in fact higher than 23 amas. But since it's only it's less than an amma, we don't consider this. It's not taken into account. But yes, l'maisa, it's true. It was more than 23 amas, but since it doesn't come up to an amma, it's not considered. It's not calculated.